When I caught Jessica cheating on me after 3 years together, the person who hurt me most wasn't my lying ex-girlfriend. It was my sister Amber, who looked me in the eye and told me I was probably being paranoid, and that Jessica deserved better than someone who didn't trust her, while I was falling apart from discovering the affair that destroyed my relationship. Amber had chosen to side with my cheating ex over her own brother, spending weeks comforting Jessica and telling her she was the real victim in our breakup, while I worked double shifts to afford therapy and tried to rebuild my life from the wreckage of a relationship I'd thought was heading toward marriage. The betrayal cut deeper than Jessica's affair, because family is supposed to be the people who stand by you when the world falls apart, not the people who kick you when you're already down. But what made it even more insulting was how much Amber and Jessica had enjoyed their alliance against me, posting supportive comments on each other's social media while treating me like the villain for being hurt by infidelity. They'd bonded over what a controlling and insecure boyfriend I'd been rewriting history to make Jessica the wronged party and me the problem that needed to be solved. Now, 18 months later, Amber was standing on the front porch of the house I'd worked my ass off to buy, holding an eviction notice and demanding that I solve her housing crisis with the same breath she'd once used to defend the woman who'd destroyed my ability to trust anyone. "You're a man," she said. Like those words could erase the memory of her choosing my cheating ex over me when I'd needed my sister most. Family helps family. But she was about to learn that the brother she'd thrown away for Jessica's sake had built himself a life where her definition of family no longer applied, and the consequences of her betrayal were about to cost her everything. To understand how my own sister could betray me so completely, you need to know about the 3-year relationship I'd built with Jessica, and how discovering her affair had nearly destroyed my ability to trust anyone. I'd been planning to propose within the year, looking at rings and thinking about our future together, when I found text messages on her phone that revealed she'd been sleeping with her coworker Marcus for months. The devastation was complete and immediate. Not just the infidelity itself, but the realization that someone I'd trusted completely had been lying to my face every single day while planning a life with someone else. I'd confronted her expecting denial, or at least remorse, but instead, she'd turned it around on me, claiming I was controlling and paranoid, and that she'd only cheated because our relationship was suffocating her. That's when I'd turned to my family for support, expecting them to see through Jessica's manipulation and help me process the betrayal that had turned my world upside down. When I caught Jessica cheating, I expected family support. Instead, Amber sided with Jessica against me. But Amber's response had been even more devastating than Jessica's affair, because she'd immediately taken Jessica's side and begun a campaign to convince me that I was the problem in the relationship. She'd spent hours on the phone with Jessica, comforting her and validating her rewritten version of our relationship, where I was the controlling boyfriend who'd driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. For years before the Jessica crisis, I'd been Amber's go-to solution whenever her financial irresponsibility caught up with her lifestyle expectations. She'd been living in her shoebox apartment for 5 years, constantly behind on rent, despite having a decent job, because she prioritized shopping and entertainment over basic responsibilities like housing costs. I'd lost count of how many times she'd called in tears about eviction notices, overdue bills, or emergency expenses that somehow always fell to me to solve. The pattern was always the same: crisis tears, promises to pay me back, and then months of silence until the next financial disaster struck. For years, I'd been Amber's emergency fund while she lived beyond her means in her shoebox apartment. The wake-up call had come during one of our family dinners, when I'd realized that Amber had never paid me back a single dollar from the thousands I'd loaned her over the years. Yet she was still posting Instagram photos from expensive restaurants and shopping trips funded by credit cards she couldn't afford. She'd been using my financial safety net to enable her irresponsible spending while treating me like a bank rather than a brother. That's when I decided to stop being everyone's solution and start building a life focused on my own peace and quiet, instead of constantly rescuing people who never showed gratitude or loyalty in return. I'd worked double shifts, lived below my means, and saved every dollar toward the down payment for a house that would represent my independence from the toxic family dynamics that had defined my 20s. The house I'd just bought wasn't just shelter. It was proof that I'd finally escaped the cycle of giving my resources to people who gave me nothing but criticism and betrayal in return. I'd finally escaped that toxic dynamic and bought myself the peace and quiet I'd worked my ass off for. The house I'd just purchased represented everything I'd fought to achieve over the past 18 months of rebuilding my life from the ground up. $40,000 for the down payment, a 30-year mortgage that I could comfortably afford on my own income, and 3 bedrooms that would finally give me the space and peace I'd been craving since I'd realized how toxic my family relationships had become. Moving day had been the first time in years that I'd felt genuinely optimistic about my future unpacking boxes in rooms that belonged to me, and only me, with no obligations to house anyone who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my loyalty. Every piece of furniture I'd arranged, and every wall I'd painted, had been a declaration of independence from people who'd treated my generosity like an entitlement. The house represented everything I'd worked for, my independence from people who'd betrayed me. But apparently, Amber had viewed my success as an opportunity rather than a boundary, because 3 weeks after I'd settled into my new place, she'd shown up on my doorstep with her crisis, and her children expecting me to solve the housing problem she'd created through her own financial irresponsibility. The eviction notice was dated, giving her 2 weeks to vacate the shoebox apartment she'd been struggling to afford for years. She'd brought the kids with her as emotional leverage, knowing I'd feel guilty about 2 innocent children being affected by their mother's poor choices and my refusal to enable those choices. The manipulation was transparent but effective. She was betting that I'd prioritize the children's immediate comfort over the long-term lesson about consequences and accountability. Her housing crisis didn't erase the fact that she'd sided with Jessica when I needed family most. My refusal was calm, but absolute, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from finally understanding your own worth and boundaries. "I'm sorry about your situation," I told her. "But this house is for me. Not for people who chose my cheating ex-girlfriend over their own brother when it mattered most." The shock on her face was immediate and complete. She'd clearly expected me to cave under the pressure of her crisis and the presence of the children, reverting to my old pattern of solving everyone else's problems while my own needs went unmet. Instead, I'd offered her practical alternatives that didn't involve compromising my own peace and sanctuary. I told her to ask Jessica for housing, since that's who she'd chosen as family. The family pressure campaign started within hours of Amber's failed visit with Mom, calling that same evening to deliver the guilt trip I'd been expecting ever since I'd refused to enable my sister's latest crisis. Her voice carried that disappointed mother tone she'd perfected over the years, designed to make me feel like a failure for not immediately sacrificing my own well-being for someone else's poor choices. "You're a man," she said, like those words contained some magical obligation that overrode my right to boundaries and self-respect. "You help family when they're in need, especially when children are involved. Amber made mistakes, but those kids didn't do anything wrong." The manipulation was so predictable, it was almost insulting, especially since Mom had been completely silent when Amber was choosing Jessica over me during my worst crisis. She'd never called to check on my mental health when I was struggling with the aftermath of betrayal, but now she was deeply concerned about family loyalty when it came to solving Amber's housing problem. Mom kept saying, "You're a man, you help family," like Amber hadn't chosen Jessica over family. By the end of the week, the extended family pressure network had been fully activated, with aunts and uncles calling to express their disappointment in my selfishness and lecture me about the importance of supporting family during difficult times. Uncle Rob called to remind me about all the times the family had helped me growing up conveniently, forgetting that those were normal parental obligations, not favors I owed interest on. Aunt Linda took a different approach, suggesting that holding grudges was unhealthy and that I needed to be the bigger person and let go of whatever had happened between Amber and me. The fact that none of them knew the actual details of what had happened didn't stop them from having strong opinions about how I should handle the situation. The irony was staggering. They were all calling me selfish without having any idea that Amber had betrayed me for my cheating ex-girlfriend, proving that their moral authority was based on ignorance rather than actual understanding of the situation. The whole family was calling me selfish without knowing Amber had sided with my cheating ex. Meanwhile, Amber had escalated her own manipulation campaign, sending me daily text messages about how her children were asking why Uncle wouldn't help them and describing their living situation in increasingly desperate terms. She'd started taking photos of the kids looking sad and sending them to me with captions about how they didn't understand why their family wouldn't help them. The emotional blackmail was transparent, but effective at making me feel guilty, even though I knew the children's situation was the direct result of their mother's financial irresponsibility and past betrayal. What made it even more insulting was that while she was sending me pictures of her struggling children, Jessica was posting vacation photos from her trip to Miami with Marcus, the same co-worker she'd cheated with. She was using her kids as emotional blackmail, while Jessica posted vacation photos on Instagram. That's when I decided I was done being reactive and needed to start documenting everything that would prove who had really been loyal to whom over the years. I started taking screenshots of Jessica's vacation posts, saving Amber's guilt trip text messages, and organizing evidence that would show the complete picture of betrayal and manipulation I'd been dealing with. The documentation process was therapeutic in its own way, because it helped me see clearly how systematically I'd been gaslit into believing I was the problem, when the real issue was my family's complete inability to recognize loyalty and betrayal when it was staring them in the face. I started screenshotting Jessica's Instagram posts and Amber's texts to prepare for the family reckoning. While organizing my evidence, I decided to calculate exactly how much money I'd loaned Amber over the years, and the numbers were staggering in their scope and her complete lack of accountability. $15,000 in emergency loans that she'd never even attempted to pay back, spread across dozens of crises that somehow always required my immediate financial intervention to solve. The pattern was always the same: tearful phone calls about eviction notices, overdue bills, car repairs, or medical expenses that she couldn't afford because she'd spent her money on shopping trips and restaurant meals instead of basic responsibilities. Each time she'd promise to pay me back as soon as things got better, but things never got better because she never changed her spending habits or lifestyle expectations. What made it even more insulting was that during the same period I'd been funding her crises, she'd been posting Instagram photos from expensive restaurants, shopping halls, and weekend trips that proved she had money for luxuries, but not for the basic adult responsibilities that kept falling to me to handle. I calculated that I'd loaned Amber over $15,000 that she'd never even attempted to repay. But the most damning evidence was what I discovered about Jessica and Amber's ongoing relationship which proved that her betrayal during my crisis hadn't been a temporary mistake, but an active choice to maintain her alliance with my cheating ex-girlfriend. Their social media interactions showed a friendship that had actually grown stronger since my breakup, with supportive comments, shared activities, and inside jokes that made it clear they viewed me as the common enemy they'd bonded over. Jessica's vacation posts from Miami included photos with Amber, commenting heart emojis, and living your best life messages, while I was dealing with family pressure to house the same person who was publicly celebrating my ex-girlfriend's happiness. The timeline was perfect. Amber was sending me guilt trips about her homeless children, while simultaneously cheering on Jessica's luxury vacation funded by her affair partner's salary. The alliance between them hadn't been about supporting Jessica during a difficult time. It had been about validating each other's rewritten version of history, where I was the villain, and they were the victims who'd escaped my unreasonable expectations of loyalty and honesty. Jessica and Amber were still posting supportive comments on each other's photos, while demanding I house one of them. Meanwhile, my own financial situation provided a stark contrast to the chaos and irresponsibility that defined the rest of my family's approach to money and life decisions. While they were dealing with constant crises and expecting me to solve them, I'd been building genuine financial security through disciplined planning and the radical decision to prioritize my own well-being over everyone else's comfort. The house payment was well within my budget. My emergency fund was healthy, and I had actual savings for the first time in my adult life, because I'd stopped subsidizing other people's poor choices. The peace of mind that came from financial independence was worth more than any family relationship based on my willingness to be exploited. My financial stability was the result of not enabling people who'd chosen my enemies over me. That's when my friend Mike reminded me of something I'd forgotten during all the family pressure, that real loyalty works both ways, and that people who truly care about you don't abandon you during your worst crisis, and then expect your help during theirs. Mike had watched the whole Jessica situation unfold and had been disgusted by how quickly Amber had turned against me. "She chose Jessica over you when you were falling apart," he said, "and now she wants you to choose her kids over your own peace of mind. That's not how family is supposed to work." Mike reminded me that real family doesn't side with the people who hurt you most. The evidence I'd compiled painted a devastating picture that would destroy any arguments about family loyalty. The text screenshots showed Amber's complete support for Jessica during our breakup, starting with her response to my discovery of the affair. "Maybe you're being paranoid," read one text from Amber to Jessica. "He's always been kind of controlling, and you deserve someone who trusts you." The messages continued for weeks, with Amber encouraging Jessica to stand up for herself and not let him guilt-trip you. The most damning evidence was a group text where Amber, Jessica, and their friends spent months dissecting my personality flaws, rewriting our relationship history to make Jessica the victim of my emotional manipulation. The text screenshots showed Amber calling me paranoid and telling Jessica she deserved better during my worst crisis. The financial documentation revealed 15 years of systematic exploitation disguised as family assistance. Bank records proved I'd been my family's unpaid loan officer since getting my first decent job. Amber's emergencies alone had cost me $15,000 over 5 years, but the family's collective drain was closer to $30,000, including my parents' temporary loans and my cousins' failed investments. None of them had ever acknowledged these as actual debts. They'd been reframed as family helping family until I needed help myself. The most insulting discovery was that family members had compared notes about extracting money from me, treating my generosity like a renewable resource rather than personal sacrifices. Bank records showed 15 years of emergency loans to family members who'd never paid me back a dime. Meanwhile, Jessica and Amber's friendship had grown stronger since driving me out of their circle. Their Instagram interactions showed regular communication and mutual support that proved the betrayal wasn't momentary judgment, but active choice to maintain their alliance. Last week, while Amber sent me guilt trips about homeless children, she commented on Jessica's spa weekend photos. "You deserve this, Queen," and "living your best life." Then she was simultaneously portraying desperate motherhood to me, while celebrating the luxury lifestyle of the woman who destroyed my trust. They were still best friends, posting vacation photos together while demanding I house one of them. The $40,000 down payment for my house represented years of discipline and sacrifice, extra shifts, careful budgeting, and choosing my own stability over everyone else's crisis management. Every dollar had been earned while stopping the drain of funding other people's poor choices. The house wasn't just shelter, it was proof I could build something solid when not constantly being exploited by people who viewed my success as their entitlement. The $40,000 down payment represented years of sacrifice, while my family criticized my selfishness. The pattern of family dependency had positioned me as permanent solution to everyone's problems, while providing zero support during my own crises. I'd been their emergency fund for 15 years. Yet when I needed emotional support during the worst betrayal of my life, they chose my cheating ex-girlfriend's comfort over my well-being. The imbalance was complete. I'd funded their lifestyle mistakes, while they funded my enemy's narrative about what a terrible person I was for expecting basic loyalty from people I'd supported financially and emotionally my entire adult life. I was the family's permanent emergency fund, while they maintained relationships with people who'd betrayed me. After compiling all the evidence of betrayal and financial exploitation, I decided it was time to take legal action to protect the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. The family pressure was only going to escalate, and I needed to make it clear that my house was completely off limits to people who'd chosen my enemies over me. I consulted with a lawyer about getting a no trespassing order against Amber, explaining the situation, and providing documentation of her demands for housing, despite her past betrayal. The legal process was straightforward. She'd already shown up uninvited, demanding entry to my property, and I had the right to prevent future harassment. The paperwork was filed within a week, and Amber was officially notified that any further attempts to visit my property without permission would result in criminal charges for trespassing. The no trespassing order made it clear that my house was off limits to people who'd betrayed me. But legal protection was just one part of the strategy, because I knew my family was coordinating their own campaign to break my boundaries and force me back into my role as their permanent solution provider. The phone calls had become more frequent and more desperate, with different family members taking turns to guilt-trip me about Amber's situation and the children's well-being. Mom had organized what was essentially a family intervention, calling a meeting at my parents' house to discuss the Amber situation and pressure me into compliance. Uncle Rob was driving down from 2 states away specifically to participate in the coordinated effort to make me feel guilty about maintaining my boundaries. The most insulting part was that they were treating my refusal to house someone who'd betrayed me as a mental health issue that needed to be corrected through group pressure, rather than a reasonable response to years of exploitation and disloyalty. They planned a coordinated intervention to break my boundaries and force me to comply. Meanwhile, I was organizing my own preparation for the family confrontation that seemed inevitable at this point. I printed out all the text screenshots, showing Amber's support for Jessica during my crisis, organized the bank records documenting 15 years of unpaid loans, and prepared a timeline that would prove exactly who had been loyal to whom over the years. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Text messages, financial records, social media interactions, and witness testimony that would destroy their narrative about family obligation and my supposed selfishness. I even prepared copies for each family member so they could see the complete picture of betrayal and manipulation I'd been dealing with. I organized every piece of evidence that would prove who'd really been loyal to whom. The most important part of my preparation was securing Mike's promise to be present during whatever confrontation was coming. He'd witnessed the entire Jessica situation unfold and had been disgusted by how quickly my family had turned against me when I'd needed support most. "I'll be there," he told me when I explained the family's planned intervention. "Someone needs to witness the truth about how they've been treating you, and maybe having an outsider present will force them to actually listen to the evidence instead of just trying to manipulate you." Having a loyal friend willing to stand by me felt like the complete opposite of everything my family had provided during my worst crisis. Actual support instead of betrayal. Loyalty instead of convenience. Mike promised to be there when my family came to force me into compliance. The family intervention arrived at my front door exactly as planned with Mom. Dad, Uncle Rob, and Amber herself, standing on the porch of the house I'd worked my ass off to buy, expecting to pressure me into submission through coordinated guilt and manipulation. They'd brought Amber's kids with them as emotional leverage, betting that I'd cave under the sight of two innocent children who were being used as weapons in their mother's war against consequences. Mike was already inside with me, positioned near the window, where he could witness everything that was about to unfold. The contrast was perfect. Loyal friend, standing by me, versus family members who'd abandoned me when I'd needed them most, now demanding my help for someone who'd chosen my cheating ex over her own brother. They showed up at the house I'd worked my ass off for demanding entry like they owned the place. Instead of inviting them inside, I stepped onto the front porch with a folder full of evidence and began presenting the documentation that would destroy their narrative about family obligation and my supposed selfishness. I started with the text screenshots reading Amber's exact words aloud, so everyone could hear how she'd supported Jessica during our breakup. "Maybe you're being paranoid," I read from her text to Jessica. "He's always been kind of controlling, and you deserve someone who trusts you." Then I showed them the group chat, where she'd called me emotionally manipulative and encouraged their friends to view Jessica as the victim of my unrealistic expectations. The silence was immediate and complete as they processed the evidence of betrayal they'd never known existed, realizing that their moral authority had been based on complete ignorance of what had actually happened during my crisis. I showed them the texts where Amber called Jessica the real victim, while I was heartbroken. The financial evidence hit them even harder because it proved that their family helps family rhetoric had been a one-way street designed to exploit my generosity while providing me with nothing in return. I presented bank records showing $15,000 in unpaid loans to Amber alone, plus the additional $15,000 I'd loaned other family members who'd never even attempted repayment. "This is what family helping family actually looked like," I said, pointing to the documented pattern of financial exploitation. Me funding everyone else's crises while getting betrayed when I had my own. The numbers were undeniable, and the timeline proved that I'd been functioning as their personal bank for 15 years while receiving nothing but criticism and abandonment when I'd needed emotional support. Uncle Rob tried to dismiss the financial documentation as keeping score, but I shut that down immediately by pointing out that keeping score was exactly what you did when people treated your generosity like an entitlement rather than a gift. The evidence showed they'd chosen my cheating ex over me while using me as their personal bank. That's when I addressed the "you're a man" manipulation, directly turning their gender-based guilt trip into a lesson about what real masculinity actually meant. "You're right, I am a man," I said, looking directly at Mom and Amber. "And being a man means protecting myself from people who sided with those who betrayed me. It means not enabling people who've proven they can't be trusted with my loyalty." The redefinition was powerful and undeniable. Real strength wasn't about tolerating abuse from people who'd hurt you. It was about having enough self-respect to enforce boundaries when family proved they couldn't be counted on during crisis situations. "You're a man" means I protect myself from people who sided with those who betrayed me. Mike's intervention from inside the house provided the external validation that proved my position was reasonable to people who weren't emotionally invested in maintaining toxic family dynamics. He came out and addressed my parents directly, explaining what he'd witnessed during the Jessica situation and how disgusted he'd been by their response. Real family doesn't side with cheaters and then demand housing from their victims. He told them with the kind of moral clarity that comes from actually understanding loyalty. You abandoned him when he needed support, and now you're angry that he's not available when you need something from him. His words carried the weight of objective truth, and the family couldn't dismiss him as biased or emotional because he'd been there to witness their betrayal firsthand. Mike told them that real family doesn't side with cheaters, and then demand housing from their victims. Standing on the porch of the house that represented my independence from their toxic dysfunction, I delivered the boundary statement that would define our relationship going forward. The calm certainty in my voice made it clear this wasn't negotiable or temporary, but a permanent consequence of choices they'd made when loyalty mattered most. "You sided with Jessica over me when I was falling apart," I said, looking at each of them. "You chose my cheating ex-girlfriend's comfort over your own son and brother's well-being. Now you can live with the consequences of that choice because the house I worked my ass off for is for people who've earned my trust, not for people who threw it away. You sided with Jessica over me. Now live with the consequences of that choice." The aftermath of that front porch confrontation was swift and complete, with my family finally understanding that their manipulation tactics had lost all power once the truth about their betrayal and exploitation had been exposed to the light. The no contact that followed wasn't my choice. It was theirs because they couldn't handle being held accountable for years of taking my loyalty for granted while giving theirs to people who'd hurt me. Amber never found housing through Jessica, despite their close friendship and mutual support during my crisis. The reality was that Jessica had been using Amber's validation to feel better about her own choices, not because she actually cared enough to help when it mattered. Within weeks, Amber had to move back in with our parents, creating the cramped living situation that could have been avoided if she'd chosen loyalty over betrayal 18 months earlier. They learned that betrayal has permanent consequences when the person you betrayed finds their strength. Meanwhile, my house became exactly what I'd intended it to be, a sanctuary of peace and quiet, where I could build authentic relationships with people who understood that loyalty works both ways. Without the constant drain of family crises and financial emergencies that weren't really emergencies, I had mental energy to invest in friendships like my relationship with Mike, who'd proven what real family support actually looked like. The extra money that stayed in my own accounts each month went toward home improvement savings, and the kind of financial security that comes from not subsidizing other people's poor choices and character flaws. My house finally gave me the peace and quiet I'd worked my ass off to achieve. Looking back now, I realize that forcing my family to face the consequences of their choices was the most loving thing I could have done for all of us, because it finally established the boundaries that healthy relationships require. Supporting family doesn't mean unlimited tolerance for people who choose your enemies over you when it matters most. Real family stands by you during your worst crisis instead of making it worse. And real loyalty doesn't come with conditions based on what you can provide financially. The difference between family and people who happen to share your DNA is simple family earns your trust and keeps it, while relatives just expect it without reciprocation. Being family doesn't mean unlimited forgiveness for people who sided with your enemies.